1 o'clock on Tuesday, April 9th, and I'm going to be recording a lesson on Latin reading during this hour. I went back to the fall term to look at the lessons we had back then and saw that we left off in John chapter 1 at verse 14. In that last video, I didn't get through verse 15 because time had run out, but I'm going to pick up today in the Latin Reading 1 course. It's lesson number 4, lesson 4. And the content is John chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. So we're going to walk through the translation of John chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. I'll share my screen in just a minute. We'll walk through this translation. And let me just say, because we're getting started here in the spring term and we've had some time off from video lessons, the goal of these lessons is obviously not to replace the need for private study. You're never going to learn a language unless you study it constantly. You've got to immerse yourself in the language and work to master the vocabulary, work to practice reading, work to do the translation exercises, and to make sure you do them in the way that you're told to do them. Just writing it down once and writing out the answer and then submitting it, you're not doing the work of those translation exercises. You're not going to learn the language. Make sure you read the instructions and do them rightly. Use the quizzes to test your mastery. Don't just, fudge your way through them or cheat your way through them and get a good grade. You're just cheating yourself. The only way that you'll ever pick up fluency in a language is to immerse yourself in it. And it's one of the most difficult things. If we think back to the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, when God wanted to divide people, he scrambled their language. And so the work of overcoming that scrambling of language, which is a work that is certainly related to the Christian mission, we see that at Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit gives the apostles the ability to speak in the languages of the world. Part of the mission of the church for all of us to go into the world and make disciples challenges us to learn languages. And learning languages has always been a significant part of Christian education. So the only way you can learn a language, it's very difficult to learn languages. The only way you can do so is to immerse yourself as much as possible in the language. And the method that we use in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is a very ancient method, taught by some of history's wisest and best men and teachers. But the translation exercises are really the key, and you've got to do them the right way. You've got to follow the instructions and do them as the instructions tell you. It tells you to copy out the original language, copy out the Latin, and then work to write the translation word by word from memory. So you should study first, then work on the translation exercise. And as you run into problems with the translation, look back to your lesson, check the words you struggle with, study them, learn them, use the translation exercise to learn those words that you struggle with, and then continue to repeat and repeat and repeat those translation exercises until you can write out the Latin text and then write out the translation without consulting your lesson for any help. You can translate it all from memory. If you don't work through that process, if you don't do the translation exercises in that way, if you don't follow the instructions, I don't know what to tell you. You're not studying the language. So don't try to take shortcuts. You have plenty of time for the study of these languages. And what's cool about the method that we use is it's the same method needed to study classical Greek. It can be the same method you use to study Spanish and Italian and French and German and so on. The method works for any language. You don't have to find someone who speaks the language. You don't have to find someone who even teaches you pronunciation, because really, as students, the first goal of language study is not to speak the language. I'm not going to run into any, Romans on the street that I need to speak to in Latin. That's not the purpose of academic study with languages. The purpose of studying different languages in school is so that we can read the works of different peoples. Because when you get to a higher level of studies, assuming that you continue your studies, when you get to a higher level of studies, there's more and more works of wise men, great scholars and teachers that is not translated into English. It's sort of locked away in foreign languages. And the study of the foreign languages gives you access to those works. And the real goal for the study of languages in school is not for the sake of business or anything like that. Not to communicate if you travel to Spain or travel someplace. That's not the goal. The goal is to be able to read, to access the writings of wise men in as many different languages as possible. And so the method that we use, the method using the translation exercises combined with the study of the grammar of the language, will give you everything that you need to become fluent for reading those languages. And the goal is to pick up as many reading languages, or in college and universities, they refer to them as research languages, languages in which you can do research, to pick up as many research languages as possible. You can imagine how important and helpful that will be. So make sure you're doing the translation exercises. Nobody cares how fast you move through the lessons if you don't actually learn the language. And as I warned this morning in our Latin grammar class, when you get to the second level of Latin studies, if you haven't followed instructions, you're going to be in big trouble, because it's going to assume that you have a level of understanding at that level that you're just not going to have. And then what are you going to do? Are you going to go back and do Latin Reading 1 all over again? You're not going to be able to move forward because it's going to be too difficult. So you're going to be stuck in a bad situation. You're not going to get away with not following instructions. So resist the temptation to try to hurry through lessons and think that because you're checking boxes and submitting things where you know you didn't follow the instructions and do it the way you're supposed to. There's no way for me to tell that. There's no way that I can tell if you've done the translation exercises from memory or if you just copied all the answers. There's no way for me to tell. And frankly, I don't worry about that when I grade. I look at the answers, see if they're correct, mark it, and that's it. Only you know whether you're actually doing the work or not. And it's your responsibility, because it's your own soul, your own knowledge, your own future learning, and you're just cheating yourself. So don't do it. Let's go ahead. Let me share the screen and we'll get into our reading for today, verses 16 through 20. And this is just on the Academy website. I'll try to zoom in. Let me actually just copy this text. Give me a minute. I'm going to stop sharing for just 1 second so I can make this text a little easier for us to study here. Give me 1 minute. Just a second. I'm going to make it easier for us to read this. Just a second. Just a second. I'll make it nice and large so you can read it with me. It should be a little bit better. Okay, so now the text is nice and big. So John chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. I'll read through this, so just listen carefully. What I recommend you do, assuming you can read the letters. If your computer screen's too small, you might not be able to read it, but I recommend you just follow along with me and sort of read it to yourself in your head. And then as you hear me read it, compare my pronunciation to yours and see if there are any points that we differ on, and what it could be that you're getting wrong, because I can assure you that I know how to pronounce the Latin. And if we disagree, it's probably because you're making a mistake. So just think about it on your own, read it on your own, and then compare how you would read it to how I read it. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me here or in the forum or by email later on. But verse 16, take a minute and just by yourself, just quickly read through verse 16. Read it out loud to yourself. Think of how you would read it. All right, now listen to me read it. Verse 16. Et de plenitudine eius nos omnes accepimus, et gratiam pro gratia. Et de plenitudine eius nos omnes accepimus, et gratiam pro gratia. One thing you might notice is when I pronounce this word here, it's not accepimus. That syllable there in the middle is pronounced che. So accepimus, accepimus. I think that's the only challenging part in the reading. Et de plenitudine eius nos omnes accepimus, et gratiam pro gratia. You may wonder, well, how do you know how to pronounce the different accents? How do you know how to accent different words? There are rules for accenting Latin words. We learn them in the Latin grammar course, which you should be studying. For example, in Latin grammar, we learned that anytime we have a word that's two syllables, like this word here, the first syllable is accented. So omnes. We have another example here, eius. Okay, so anytime there's a two-syllable word, the first syllable is always accented. And then we learned that the accent of longer words like plenitudine and accepimus and gratiam and gratia, they're three or more syllables. We have to know a little bit more information to know how to pronounce them rightly. You need to study grammar to learn those rules. There are two simple rules. But by this point, I've been studying Latin for 25 years. I know most of this just by experience, but there are rules for accentuation, pretty simple, and you need to study them in grammar. So verse 16, the translation, et de plenitudine, and from plenitudine means fullness. In English, we have the word plentitude, and from the plentitude eius, his. Eius is a pronoun. If you're with me this morning for the Latin grammar course, remember I mentioned that when you do the Latin reading lessons, you should take time to learn what part of speech each word is, because as you study grammar, you can use your Latin reading as a source of endless examples for everything that you learn in grammar. So we see et is a conjunction, de is a preposition, plenitudine is a substantive noun, eius is a pronoun, nos is another pronoun, omnes is an adjective, accepimus is a verb, and so on. You should work to be able to identify the parts of speech for each word in your reading. You don't need to do that in Latin Reading 1. In Latin Reading 1, we're really just learning vocabulary and practicing translation while we study Latin grammar. But in Latin Reading 2, you're going to need to know and be able to give the grammar, all that grammatical information for the different words. Because in Latin Reading 2, we're going to assume that you've also studied Latin Grammar 1. So if you haven't done that, make sure you get started with Latin grammar. And I'm teaching through that week by week, so there will be videos available. Okay, so et de plenitudine eius, and from his plenitude, or from his fullness, nos omnes accepimus. Nos is a pronoun that means we. Omnes means all. We all of us. We all. Accepimus. We have received. From his fullness, we have all received. And you'll notice that for that verb there, you'll notice I translate it with the past tense. We have received. It's past tense. And if you wonder, well, how in the world do you know that? How do you know that that's a past tense verb? The answer is it's based on the form of the verb. The tense is revealed in the form of the verb. For example, there's all kinds of information in this verb. When I look at this and see this mus ending at the end, that tells me that it should be translated we. It's first person plural. The person of the verb is present in that ending. It tells me it's first person plural, we. And then when I look at the verb, I see accepi, and I know that that's not the normal form of this verb because I know the vocabulary. I know that if I look up this verb in a dictionary, I'm not going to find accepi in the dictionary. I'm going to find the verb accipio. Accipio. It's got an I after the C. A-C-C-I. Accipio. So the stem of this verb has been changed, and that change reveals that it's a past tense verb. So that's why when I look at that verb, I can see that part in the middle there, chepi, and I know it's past tense, it's perfect tense. And I see mus at the end, and I know it's first person plural, so it's going to be translated we. This is also confirmed by the fact that the subject is given here with the pronoun we, so it's emphasized. We all have received. Now, sometimes in the lessons, you'll see that the translation is given we have received, and we is put in parentheses. The reason why we is put in parentheses in the translation is because you don't necessarily have to say it. And here's a good example of that because the pronoun we is already given in the sentence. So you don't need to repeat the person. So from the fullness from his fullness, we all have received. Et gratiam pro gratia. And grace pro in place of or for grace. Grace in place of grace. And that seems to be an expression like grace upon grace, grace on top of grace. We've received abundantly. Okay. The word gratia in this context has the idea of favor, like goodness, generosity, grace upon grace. From his fullness, we have all received, and grace in place of grace. Verse 17, take a minute and read verse 17. Read it out loud to yourself or in your head. Practice the pronunciation and see if you can get it all correct when I read it in a minute. Verse 17. All right, follow me here and check your own pronunciation. Verse 17, quia lex per moisen, that's a little tricky, moisen data est. Quia lex per moisen data est. Gratia et veritas per Iesum, not Jesum, but Iesum, per Iesum Christum facta est. Quia lex per moisen data est, gratia et veritas per Iesum Christum facta est. So from his fullness we have all received, and grace, or even grace in place of grace. Now notice when it says grace in place of grace in the next sentence here in verse 17, the next line I should say, it compares two things. It compares the law of Moses and the grace and truth of Christ. So when it says grace in place of grace, it may be referring to these two things, the law of Moses and the gospel of Christ. We'll talk about that in a minute. So quia is a conjunction, means because lex means law. If you look up the word lex in a Latin dictionary, which you should if you want to master the language, if you look up lex in a dictionary, you'll see that the stem is actually leg, leg. And if you think in English we have legal, the word legal or legislature refers to law. So that stem leg comes from this noun here, lex. Quia lex, because the law per Moisen, through Moses, that Moisen is the Latin form or Latin word for Moses, because the law through Moses data est, and literally that translates as given is, data est. So that word data, you'll see that in English, data. We think of it in terms of information with computers and things like that. You wonder, what in the world does that have to do with data in the Bible, right? That word means given. And in mathematics, we're usually given some information to work with when we solve problems and things like that. So we refer to data or data in mathematics. And then over time, as computer science developed, that word data ends up moving into computer science. But we can trace it back to this word here, back in Latin, data, which just means given. The law, through Moses, data est, is given. And it's worth noting there that the law was not created by Moses. He didn't sit there and think of it. The law is God's law, and it was given to us through Moses. Moses was the man who was inspired to give us the law of the Old Testament. The law was given through Moses, gratia et veritas, grace and truth. Veritas is truth. Grace and truth through Jesus Christ, per Jesum Christum, facta est. Now notice the difference between data est was given and facta est is made. Facta means made, est means is. The phrase facta est can be translated in the past tense, was made. The law was given to us by Moses, but grace and truth were made or produced for us through Jesus Christ. And I would argue that that's what verse 16 is referring to when it says grace in place of grace. It was generous for God to give the Jews the law of Moses. That was itself an act of grace. The Psalms often talk about how blessed Israel is because they were given the law, and God did not reveal the law to any other nation, only to the Jews. That was an act of grace, giving the Jews the law of Moses. But in place of that grace, even greater grace is given, the grace and truth of the gospel, which is made through Jesus Christ. Verse 17. Okay. Verse 18 starts with a very interesting phrase, which many will think doesn't sound right, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Go ahead and read for yourself verse 18. Practice the translation out loud. See how you do. Give you a minute for that. All right, verse 18 reads, Deum, nemo, don't say nemo, nemo, vidit umquam. Deum, nemo, vidit umquam. Unigenitus, filius, qui est in sinu patris, ipse enaravit. Deum nemo vidit umquam, unigenitus filius, qui est in sinu patris, ipse enaravit. And we have this very interesting line here at the beginning of verse 18. Deum nemo vidit umquam. Deum translates as God. Nemo means no one. Vidit, the stem you can see vid, that's where we get the word video from. In English, it means to see. Deum nemo vidit, God, no one, in its past tense, has seen. Umquam, ever. Deum there is the object of the verb. You see it ends in an M. It's an accusative case. I don't expect you to know all of this grammatical information because you're just getting started with reading one, but I'm just explaining it. You see Deum here ends in M instead of S. When you see Deus, it's being used as a subject of a verb. When you see Deum, it's being used as an object, so the meaning changes. So Deum is not the subject of this sentence. Nemo is the subject, which means no one or nobody. No one has seen God ever. No one has ever seen God. And so remember, this was written in the time of Christ, which is very interesting because we might think, wait a minute, what do you mean no one has ever seen God? Didn't Moses see God? Wasn't Moses talking with God at the burning bush? Didn't Moses see God on Mount Sinai when God gave him the law? In Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 6, Isaiah says, I saw the Lord. And he describes what he saw when he had a vision and was given this opportunity to see God. How can it say in John chapter 1, no one has ever seen God? Well, it says what it says, and it means what it says. No one has ever seen God, not in the way that Christ has, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was in the bosom of the Father, as we're going to see here. The Word was with God, in the presence of God. No one has ever seen God. There may be statements in the Old Testament that someone saw the Lord, but we're talking about a vision that was given, right? A revelation. No one has ever been in the presence of God before Christ came. It's impossible. We're separated from God by sin. No one can be with God. In the Old Testament, we may read stories about how, like today in sacred scripture class, we read about a man named Enoch who didn't die because it says the Lord took him. But he didn't see God because John 1 tells us no one has ever seen God. Elijah was also taken before he died by God, but he didn't see God because we're told no one has ever seen God. No one has ever seen God. Verse 18, unigenitus filius. Unigenitus is an adjective. Filius is a substantive. Unigenitus filius, the only begotten Son. The only begotten Son, unigenitus, only begotten, filius, Son. The only begotten Son, qui is a pronoun, who is in sinu patris. In sinu means bosom. Like imagine holding a child in your arms. That warm, comfy area where you hold a baby, that's called the bosom, right? The bosom. That's the idea of a bosom. It's sort of close and intimate with someone, to be in someone's bosom. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, sinu patris, in sinu patris. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, ipse, he himself, enaravit, has. Enaravit means to explain or to make known. The only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained. Okay, so no one has ever seen God. The only person who has ever seen God is God's only begotten Son himself, the Word, who was in the beginning with God. He has explained him. He has revealed him. We're taught in verse 18. So while people may claim that they had seen God, it was speaking in a figurative way. They had seen God maybe through a revelation or in some sign or symbol or something like that. But only Christ had actually been in the presence of the Father, the Son of God in the bosom of the Father. Okay, so verse 18, God no one has seen ever, the only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he himself has explained. Verse 19. This is a little longer verse. Go ahead and read for yourself verse 19. Practice good pronunciation. Verse 19. All right, verse 19. Listen carefully and compare my pronunciation with yours. Verse 19. Et hoc est testimonium Ioannis. Listen careful to that one. Don't say Joannis. Ioannis. In Latin, that letter that looks like a J is actually an uppercase I. So really this name is Ioannis, and it should be pronounced Ioannis. Ioannis. Now the reason why it's written as a J, and again we study this in grammar, the reason it's written as a J is because when that vowel I is put at the beginning of a Latin word, when you read it, even if you read it like a vowel, io, it has a sound like the letter Y. It sounds like a consonant. And so in Latin, what was done was that initial letter I started to be written with a different symbol to signify that it's read like a consonant. And that's eventually where our letter J came from. Hoc est testimonium Ioannis. Ioannis. Cuando miserunt, and then we have a couple challenging words here. This word here, you just have to break it down into syllables and read it slowly. Eudai. Eudai. That would be more of a classical pronunciation. Church Latin would be Eudei. Eudei. We see the same thing. We have that initial consonantal I, if you want to get nerdy about it, but it looks like a J. It's read like the letter Y. Eudei. Here we've got the diphthong AE, pronounced as one vowel sound, E in Church Latin or I in Classical Latin. Eudei. Ab, and then we've got this killer here, Yerosolumis. Yerosolumis. Notice that in the beginning there, we've got this letter upsilon, right? And we're told in grammar that really this letter is only used in words that are borrowed from Greek. And that upsilon in Greek has a weird pronunciation. It's sort of in between the letter U and the letter E. It's pronounced U, U, U. It's a weird sound that we don't use in English. Okay, so we've got Eudei ab Yerusolumis. Yerosolumis. Yerosolumis. Okay, we see that again, that initial J is pronounced like a Y. Yerosolumis. Sacerdotes. Sacerdotes. Sacerdotes et levitas. Levitas. So let's read that again quickly. Et hoc est testimonium Ioannis, quando miserunt Iudei ab Hierosolumis sacerdotes et levitas ad eum ut interrogarent. Interrogarent. Start when you see difficult words, just read them slowly. Focus on each syllable. Interrogarent. And then put it together. Interrogarent. Interrogarent. Takes a couple times to practice, and then you'll get it. Make sure the accent is put in the right place. Interrogarent. And then lastly, eum. And then we have the question, tu, quis es? Tu, quis es? So that's verse 19. Long and a little bit challenging verse to read and pronounce correctly. One more time real quick. Et hoc est testimonium Ioannis, quando miserunt Iudei ab Hierosolumis, sacerdotes et levitas ad eum ut interrogarunt eum. Tu, quis es? Verse 19. So let's translate it now. And this hoc is the testimony, that's pretty easy. And this is the testimony, Ioannis, of John. This ending here on this noun tells us that it's the genitive case. And again, you don't know this yet because you're just getting started with grammar, most likely. This is the testimony of John. Cuando, when, same exact word in Spanish. Cuando means when. Cuando miserunt, when they sent. Who sent? Iudei ab Hierosolumis. When the Jews from Jerusalem, this word Hierosolumis is the Latin form of Jerusalem. When the Jews from Jerusalem sent. So Jews from Jerusalem is the subject of this verb miserunt. The Jews from Jerusalem sent. What did they send? Who did they send? They sent sacerdotes et levitas. Sacerdotes means priests. Levitas means Levites. That was the religious class in Jerusalem. So this is the testimony of John when sent the Jews from Jerusalem, priests and Levites, ad eum, to him. Ad is a preposition. It means to, and then eum is a pronoun, means him. Whenever you see pronouns, you should stop and ask yourself, what is the pronoun referring to? Eum is referring back to John. Okay? This is the testimony of John when Jews from Jerusalem were sent, when Jews from Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to him, to John, ut. Ut is a conjunction. It means so that. So that interrogarent. That means they might ask or they might question him. And you know, in English, we have the word interrogation, right? Interrogation, usually it's used in the context of a crime investigation where police officers or military officers will interrogate someone. They'll question them, try to get information. So the Jews from Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to John, who was out in the wilderness, that they might interrogate him, that they might question him. And what they want to know is this question. Tu, quis es? Tu is a pronoun, means you, quis, who, and then es means you are, or are you, who are you? Or you could read that, who are you, with an emphasis on you. Who are you? You, who are you? That's the idea, okay? Who in the world are you? That's verse 19. Go ahead and read verse 20 here. Take your time, try to read it, pronounce it carefully, clearly. Verse 20. All right, verse 20. Et confessus est, et non negavit, et confessus est quia non sum ego Christus. Et confessus est, et non negavit, et confessus est quia non sum ego Christus. So Jews from Jerusalem send priests and Levites to John to ask him, who are you? Verse 20 tells us, and confessus est, and he confessed. John confessed, et non negavit, and not he denied. So, and he confessed, and not he denied, or he did not deny. But, or and, confessus est, he confessed, quia, that, and then this was his answer. Non sum ego Christus. Not, sum means I am, not I am. Ego is a pronoun that also means I. So again, we have this idea of emphasizing the person. Because when we say sum, we already know it refers to I, the first person. But to add ego adds emphasis to that, to add the pronoun. Non sum ego. Not am I, Christus. I am not the Christ. So notice here in verse 20, John knows what they're actually asking him. When they ask him, who are you? They're not asking for his name. They're not asking for his date of birth and his address. They're coming to ask if he is the Christ, or if he claims to be the Christ, or if he thinks he is the Christ. John knows what they're asking him. He knows they're not just asking his name. And so his answer gives them the answer that they're seeking. He says, I'm not the Christ. So you see how he gets ahead of them and answers their question, knowing what they're actually interested in. Okay? So that brings us to the end of verse 20. So pronunciation, you have to make sure you take the time and make the effort to practice good Latin pronunciation. Once you practice it and get the hang of it, you just can sort of hear it and feel it, and that becomes your guide for how to read words you've never seen before. You just sort of get the hang of it. Just like in English, you pronounce words in English, you don't think about the words, you just know the rhythm, you know what things sound like, and it's you're just accustomed to it. The same thing will happen in Latin eventually if you work at it. So if you cut corners and don't study well and don't do the work carefully, you won't get any better. But if you do study carefully, you'll get better at it and you'll start to get a sense. You can just sort of feel and hear proper Latin pronunciation, which is the goal. But you need to practice that. And then with the translation, everything is obviously provided for you in the lesson. So you don't need to hang on my translation in our meetings here in these videos. It's provided all word by word. But again, please take my warning to do the translation exercises in the right way. Copy the Latin, do your best, translate as much as you can with no help. Don't just start looking up words and just, I'm not asking you just to copy words from that page onto this page. Obviously, that's not the goal. Write out the Latin and then challenge yourself. Translate as much as you can without looking at the lesson. And so go through and fill in all the translation that you can. And when you get to the end of it, whatever you haven't been able to translate, make a note of that because those are the words you're struggling with. Then go look them up. But don't just look them up and mindlessly copy them. Look them up, review them, study them, learn them, copy them into the lesson, get that finished, then do that translation exercise again. Try again to translate the whole thing from memory. If you can't do it, look up those words, study them, learn them. Don't forget them the next time. Next time, do it again. Go through the translation exercise. Write out the Latin. Write out the translation from memory as best you can. Continue to do that until you can do it automatically without having to look up any words in the lesson. That's when you know you've actually completed the translation exercise. That's how the exercise is designed to work. Then you can take your quiz, get your credit for the vocabulary, and move on. Okay, so when I ask you to submit a translation exercise, I'm asking for a final copy, which you should have been able to do from memory without any help from your lesson. I'm asking you to give a copy. And the only reason I'm asking for a copy is so I have evidence that you've even done one translation exercise and you're not just sneaking to the quiz and going through the quiz, which is never going to prepare you for Latin Reading 2. So I ask you to give me your final copy of your Latin translation exercise, but I assume that you followed the instructions and did it the right way. And if you didn't, I can't catch you now. I can't catch you now. Your parents can catch you if they're supervising your work, but I can't catch you now. But I'm going to catch you in Latin Reading 2 because you're not going to be able to translate. So don't do it. Don't think you're clever and cut corners and ignore the directions. You're going to get yourself into a real hole. And I'm not going to say that you're going to be able to get out of that hole if you get into it. So don't do it. Don't ignore the instructions and think that you're so smart that you can just skip over it and submit it and get credit. I'm assuming you're following the instructions, and I'm going to catch you in Latin Reading 2. So don't do it. These translation exercises, kids often fuss about them just because kids like to fuss about everything, but they're not that hard. They're actually very helpful. They help you to really master the vocabulary. They help you to learn the texts. They help you to learn the language really well. And like I said, they prepare you for the next level of Latin study. So try to enjoy them. They're a little more fun, I think, if you do them by hand. If you do them on paper, write out the Latin and then write out the translation by hand. I think that's a little more enjoyable than typing things. And then just submit your final copy so you can prove that you've been working on those translation exercises. Okay? So that's all for John chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. What I'll do before we leave here right now is I'll just make one more full reading of this passage because I know that students and parents who ask for Latin reading classes, they're often most concerned about pronunciation. They want to make sure they learn good pronunciation. So follow me along. I'll read through it all one more time and give one last translation before we wrap up here, as we're just about out of time. So John chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. Read along with me and try to pronounce it as best as you can. Verse 16. Et de plenitudine eius nos omnes accepimus, et gratiam pro gratia. Verse 17. quia lex per Moisen data est, gratia et veritas per Iesum Christum facta est. Verse 18. Deum nemo vidit umquam, unigenitus filius, qui est in sinu patris, ipse enaravit. Verse 19. Et hoc est testimonium Ioannis, quando miserunt Iudei ab Hierusolomis sacerdotes et levitas. Oops. Daniel, cut that out for now. Verse 19. Et hoc est testimonium Ioannis, quando miserunt Iudei ab Hierusolomis sacerdotes et levitas ad eum, ut interrogarent eum, tu quis es? Verse 20. Et confessus est, et non negavit, et confessus est quia non sum ego Christus. That's the Latin for verses 16 through 20. And very quickly, the translation. And from fullness his, we have received, and grace in place of grace. Because, or for, the law through Moses given is, grace and truth through Jesus Christ made is. God no one has seen ever, the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he himself has explained. And this is the testimony of John when they sent, that is, the Jews from Jerusalem, priests and Levites to him, that they might ask him, You, who are you? Verse 20. And he confessed, and not did deny, and confessed that not I am I, the Christ. So that's the translation for 16 through 20. Okay? All of that information is in your lesson, so you can study it on your own. Many of you may have already studied it, but it's good to review, practice your pronunciation, and review these translations. Go back once in a while, retake old quizzes, keep all the vocabulary fresh, because remember, the goal of Latin Reading 1 is to build your vocabulary. Just like when you're a little kid, when you're a toddler in the house, you just start learning the vocabulary of your parents. You start hearing words. You start building your vocabulary. You learn to speak by repeating words. That's the goal of Latin Reading 1, just to begin building vocabulary like little toddlers, okay? But at the same time, you know what's coming in Latin Reading 2. You should be studying Latin grammar. You should be working to understand the grammar as you go through this, because you're preparing for level 2, which is going to be much more difficult. So make sure you're going through the lessons, look at all the information in the lessons, ask any questions that come up, anything that's not clear to you, make sure you ask for help, because that's what a student does. A student is one who is seeking understanding of a subject, and you have to take responsibility and go get it. You have to go get the information. You have to ask for help, ask questions, and so on. You've got to get it. You've got to work to get it. And in the end, you separate yourself from those who do not do the work to go get it. And that's where the rewards of study really come from. Not just in yourself, because you actually achieve the goals of studies. That's one reward, but also socially. You receive rewards for having been the one who does the work and possesses the knowledge. So make sure you study the right way for the right reasons. And in the end, you can trust that you'll be rewarded for it. Okay, so that's all for today. Chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. I don't have another class until 3 o'clock, so I can hang out for a few minutes. So if you have any questions, I'll check out those questions on the chat here. But for the rest of you, that's all for today. You can get going. I'll have these videos up on the website tonight, and if you need to watch them over again, you can. But we'll meet again next week for the next lesson in Latin reading. And remember, you can work as fast as you can through these lessons. You just use these videos as a help. because really, you want to make as much progress as possible because there's so much to study. So don't wait for the next week or wait for the next video. Just keep moving, keep studying, keep completing the assignments, keep moving forward. There's so much to do. All right. I hope that's helpful. God bless everybody.